I have been having such technical difficulty with YouTube right now. I'm sorry, man. Let me try this one more time. I'm gonna end this and then we'll see if we can get the video to come up right. This is ridiculous. Is it really that way? Oh, wait a minute. Did we get it? Oh, nice. Okay, there we go. I swear, the first time I tried to upload or start the live stream, it wouldn't go live. I'm not sure why. But now we're here and we're going to break this stuff down. Okay. Hey, great to see you, Cody. Great to see you, everybody. Really, I'm going to break down the credible threat theory some more, just because I believe that it is so relevant to what's going on right now. And considering the video that I had done earlier today and one that I had done, a few days ago, 4 or 5 days ago, I've gotten a lot of new subscribers who've come to the channel, and I got a lot of people who are questioning this credible threat theory, trying to figure out exactly what it is and how it's being used. And it's very difficult to understand, especially if you are new to the game, like trying to understand economics, or if you've never heard of the credible threat theory, or if, you kind of been stuck on this idea that the Federal Reserve is going to create this hyperinflation scenario and that there's no control over it and they don't know what they're doing, and, kind of feel like the Federal Reserve has no clue of what's going on or something of that nature. So, and this is pretty common belief. And, I'm not trying to say that that's wrong. There's actually probably a lot of truth to a lot of what it is that people are thinking out there. But if you don't incorporate what it is that the Federal Reserve has communicated about their strategy going back years, then it'll make it very difficult to make the appropriate decision going forward. Because a lot of times we'll take in this idea that, just for example, of like a 2% target, and how it is that we think that the Federal Reserve is going to be behaving in the idea that they're trying to get inflation to this 2% target. And when you think about it in this fashion, it leads you to think, okay, well, the Federal Reserve would then need to keep interest rates elevated for a significant amount of time in order to reach this 2% target. But then all of a sudden we hear this language change, and now they're going to be like either pulling back on the interest rate cuts, may even have to raise interest rates, but yet they're not at the 2% target. And people get very confused about what it is that's taking place out there. Some people start throwing out the idea that it's about the labor market, but yet here we are still historically low labor. Other people want to say it's all about the 1%ers and that it's all about the market and saving the ultra rich and all that other stuff. Okay. Again, a lot of truth to all that stuff. And I'm not trying to knock any of that. Like, I'm not trying to say that all that stuff isn't really happening. What I am trying to say is that what I'm about ready to share with you, and what I have left down in the description is the links to, is the Federal Reserve's own words. This is them saying this. Now, when I put all these pieces together, you can say, oh yeah, well, they're just lying about that too. However, I don't hear anybody else except for the few of us here on this channel who discuss these matters. So again, I left links down in the description. You can go and read all this stuff for yourself. Go and judge it for yourself. Figure out whether or not you want to agree with it. But what I'm about ready to share with you, again, is not something that's discussed on the mainstream media. It's not discussed amongst other economists out there. It's not discussed anywhere except for here on the Uneducated Economist, where I am just so just constant on this. Okay, it's not even funny anymore. All right, so first thing I want to start with is I'm not even really going to go back to the Ben Bernanke speech. I mean, I think it's important to talk about the Ben Bernanke speech, especially when it comes to the credible threat theory. But I think today, instead of dragging it all the way back that far, I just want to talk about the inflation and how it is that the Federal Reserve is truly going for an inflation rate that is above 2%. They're going for an average inflation rate over time with no mathematical formula for figuring it out. And I have a wonderful little document that comes from the Federal Reserve that does explain what it is that they do look at for this average inflation rate, or at least gives us a clue of what it is that they do look at. All right, so let's start with the first speech, right? One that I've covered a million times. Everybody's heard me talk about this, and I'm going to make John Williams wish he had never written it, and that is Monetary Policy Strategies for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. Okay, left a link down in the description. Go, again, you can go and read it for yourself. This speech was given November 30th of 2018. And although you guys heard me talk about the problem that they need to solve, right? Because this is the one section of the speech that really exposes the Federal Reserve, in that, I guess let me take it back a little bit. At this point, the Federal Reserve still hadn't had an inflation rate that was consistent at 2%. They were consistently under 2%. They got above it, a few times. But for the most part, for the previous 10 years, they had failed to achieve a 2% target. They were under 2% most of the time. So that's important to understand, that the Federal Reserve was failing to achieve their 2% goal target for 10 years. Like, they've never been able to do it. Anyway, this is what it has to say. Today we face an altogether different set of problems stemming from a very low neutral interest rate. That is, the short-term real interest rate consistent with an economy operating at its potential alongside low and stable inflation. Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low. Okay, so in 2018, November of 2018, the Federal Reserve was complaining that the inflation rate that they had anticipated coming or being there for the economy at 2% failed to be achieved. It was under that 2%. This is going to create a problem for the Federal Reserve, right? Because when the Federal Reserve has a very low interest rate or very low neutral interest rate, this makes it very difficult for the Fed to operate with their monetary policy of adjusting interest rates. And he goes on to explain it right here. And this is John Williams' speech again, the Monetary Policy Strategy for a Low Neutral Interest Rate World. It says here, what does a low neutral interest rate mean for monetary policy anchoring of inflation expectations? When a recession hits, central banks may not be able to reduce interest rates well below their neutral level to stimulate the economy as warranted because of the effective lower bound on nominal interest rates. And now I know that's kind of confusing for a lot of people out there, but if you're hearing it, what he is saying is that the Federal Reserve would not be able to drop their interest rates well below the neutral interest rate without hitting the lower bound of zero. And they would not be able to drop them far enough to stimulate the economy. And now I'll read it again, just kind of listen for it. When a recession hits, central banks may not be able to reduce interest rates well below their neutral level to stimulate the economy as warranted because of the effective lower bound on the nominal interest rate. They hit the lower bound of zero. It's not far enough below neutral. They can't stimulate the economy. It's not working. They need higher inflation. They need higher inflation to raise the neutral interest rate. That is the main problem. Again, you can go and read this speech for yourself. I'm not going to break the whole speech down, but that's what he's saying inside of this. Now, there's one more section in here I want to share with you, because then we can start reading these other speeches and it all comes back to this. All right? Now, in this speech, he's talking about a few options to deal with the fact that they need to find this higher inflation expectation or a higher inflation scenario. Again, if you read the whole speech, it's really good. He talks all about it. But we're just going to break it down to this one spot here where he says this. The second option, this is the second option to try and deal with this too low of inflation expectation, the ironic problem they needed to solve with the higher inflation expectation, right? So this is what he has to say. The second option is an average inflation targeting, whereby the central bank purposefully aims to achieve an above target inflation rate. The central bank purposefully aims to achieve an above target. There's the target. What are you trying to shoot for? Above that. All right, let me read it again. Whereby the central bank purposefully aims to achieve an above target inflation rate in good times when the lower bound is not constrained. Or is not a constraint. Properly designed and implemented, such an overshoot can offset the inflation undershoot during bad times so that the long-run average inflation rate and inflation expectations are in line with the target. You see what the target is? It's the long-run inflation, not the 2%, not right now. Right now, they're talking you need above the target. That's what he said, right? Purposefully aims to achieve an above target inflation rate. It's like, hey, what are you aiming at? 2%? What are you going to do? I'm going to aim above that, right? I'm going to above the target. That's what we're shooting for. Not shooting for the target, shooting above that. So this is what John Williams was saying would be a solution to the problems that they were facing back in 2018 when it came to an inflationary scenario. All right. Now, right here is Powell's speech given August 27th of 2020. Right? Not too much longer, a little over a year, almost 2 years later. Right? 2 years later, Jerome Powell, August 27th, 2020, this speech is New Economic Challenges and the Fed's Monetary Policy Review. Okay. Now, in this speech, he has this to say, and this is probably, about 3/4 of the way down. He has this to say: the persistent undershoot of inflation from the 2% long-run objective is a cause for concern. Now remember, this is before the inflationary scenario hit. This is 2020. Things haven't kicked off yet, right? We're about ready to run into some serious inflation, but it hasn't occurred. Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. The Fed would want to push up inflation. This is what Jerome Powell will say, right? Many find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation. After all, low and stable inflation is essential for a well-functioning economy. And we are certainly mindful of the higher prices for essential items, such as food, gasoline, and shelter, and to the burdens faced by many families, especially those struggling with lost jobs and incomes. So they say it right there. Right? Many would find it counterintuitive that the Fed would want to push up inflation, considering all this pain and suffering it would create. The Fed knew it. They knew it right then when they said it. August 27th of 2020. Jerome Powell was very much well aware of what he was saying. However, here's a problem. Inflation that is persistently too low poses a serious risk to the economy. This is the serious risk to the economy, is that an inflation that is persistently too low. You hear that? Like, this is where people are lost on the Federal Reserve. Everybody thinks that they didn't want inflation, like they don't know what they're doing. They desperately needed it. Persistently too low inflation poses a serious risk to the economy. He goes on to say, inflation that runs below its desired level can lead to an unwelcome fall in long-term inflation expectations, which in turn can pull actual inflation even lower, resulting in an adverse cycle of ever low inflation and inflation expectations. They were scared of not having it. They weren't scared of inflation. They weren't scared of whether or not they were going to be able to fight inflation. They were scared of it, that they couldn't find it. They needed it bad. All right. Let me see here. Oops. Okay. So now talking about this 2% and how, it's been down in under the 2% target. Jesus, what's going on here, guys? Okay, there we go. This is what he goes on to say. To prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement, now this is important right here, because a lot of people don't realize this is why they are not going for a 2% target anymore, but going for a 2% average inflation rate over time. It's because of this right here, the new statement. Right? The new statement: to prevent this outcome and adverse dynamics that could ensue, our new statement indicates that we will seek to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, following periods when inflation has been running below 2%, Appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation moderately above 2% for some time. In seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, we are not tying ourselves to a particular mathematical formula that defines the average. Thus, our approach could be viewed as a flexible form of average inflation targeting, also known as FAIT, F-A-I-T, flexible average inflation targeting. This is what the Federal Reserve is truly doing. Moderately above 2% for some time. Thus, our decision about appropriate monetary policy will continue to reflect a broad array of considerations and will not be dictated by any formula. Of course, if excessive inflationary pressures were to build, inflation expectations were to ratchet above levels consistent with our goal, that's their goal, future expectations of inflation, right? We would not hesitate to act. Now, this speech is full of really good stuff. I just read a very small section of it. I encourage everybody to go and read all these speeches that I have left down in the description. The links are all there to every one of these. Okay, now we're going to move on. We've already covered 2. Thank you very much, Kevin, for the $4.99. Give me just a little bit here. I'm going to go through this and then I'll read your well, let me just read it right now. We'll take a quick break. Thank you for the super chat too. Yui, I think I get your theory, but the Fed will still get what they want in the end. Inflating our purchasing power away and making the rich richer. Okay, Kevin, do you see how okay, let's just take a quick break and let's think about what you just said right there, because what you have done is you have an elevated inflation expectation, which is what the Federal Reserve needed for you to do in order to save their ass. You understand that, right? I mean, just think about that. The Federal Reserve right here is in a panic situation that they cannot find the inflationary expectations coming into the future to save their monetary policy. They needed everybody out there to be panicked that they were losing their purchasing power through the inflationary expectations that would come to their mind if they actually believed it. And here it is, and it's saving them, right? Elevated inflation expectations going into the future is saving the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. That is what I am breaking down right now, right? They could not find it. They were desperate for it. Ben Bernanke, there's another speech. I don't know if I left it. Yeah, I did. I'm sure I did. There's another speech down in there from Ben Bernanke way back in 2001 talking about deflation and how to prevent it from ever occurring here. And he described within that speech all the things that it would take to prevent it from occurring. And then if it did, he says the last ditch effort was quantitative easing. You can go into massive asset purchases, right? He described it literally 7 years before it happened. These guys are not scared of inflation. They are scared of deflation. And nobody knows that. And as long as everybody is scared to death about inflation, they are able to save their monetary policy. And I'm explaining it how right now, right? The higher the inflation expectation goes, the higher the neutral interest rate will go. And that will give them the scope that they need to deliver a monetary policy with an interest rate adjustment that can then actually stimulate the economy. This is what they are doing right now with an elevated inflation expectation that you are carrying. What you are doing is giving the Federal Reserve the ammo they need to conduct themselves with an interest rate adjustment monetary policy going into the future if they had a recessionary pressure occur. That's what's taking place right now. I know this stuff is deep and I know it's hard, and sometimes I sound like I'm a crazy dude with a tinfoil hat on, but it's right there. It's all right there in the speeches, right? I left the links all right there for you. You don't have to believe me. You don't even have to trust the words that I'm saying. Just go and read them for yourself and internalize that information, and you will see it too. And then you will realize this is exactly what the Federal Reserve was hoping for, is that people would be scared of inflation. Again, right here, right? Ironically, the problem we need to solve these days is the risk of inflation that is persistently too low rather than too high. They're getting it too high. This is a thumbs up for the Federal Reserve's game. And again, like, I know we're scared of it. We don't like it. We see our purchasing power flying out the door and we wonder what it is that we can do to try and save it. And we look at the Federal Reserve and we think, man, you're doing this to us on purpose and all this, you're horrible. And look at this inflation. It's going to get worse and I'm pissed off about it. And they're on the other side going, yeah, that really sucks, dude. Yeah. We get it. We know it's painful. They said it. Jerome Powell said it's painful. We know how much pain the people experience from this inflation. However, if we don't do it, it'll cause a serious problem to the economy. They knew that they were going to do this to you, right? And I mean, whether you like it or not, I mean, I guess it's kind of beside the point. They said they were going to do it. You could have prepared yourself for this idea knowing that they were going to throw this inflationary expectation at everybody. And if everybody had it, they would be able to save their monetary policy. So it was critical for everybody to feel the inflationary pain. It was absolutely critical of it. All right, let's move on here. Let's continue on. All right, so let's talk about that statement, right? Because Jerome Powell said that they had changed their statement. Remember that? I mean, in the speech here. Okay, so in that statement, this is what it is. The statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategies. Again, the link's down in the description. It has this to say. The committee has the ability to specify long-run goal for inflation. The committee reaffirms its judgment that inflation at the rate of 2% as measured by the annual change in the price index for personal consumption expenditures is the most consistent over the long run with the Federal Reserve's statutory mandate. The committee judges that long-term inflation expectations that are well anchored at 2% foster price stability and moderate long-term interest rates and enhance the committee's ability to promote maximum employment in the face of significant economic disturbances. I know there's a lot of words said right there, but to hear it clearly is that the committee is seeking to achieve a 2% anchored inflation rate over the long term. They want people to believe that 2% is the goal, no matter what. Up, down, sideways, whatever, 2% is it. That's it. They don't say anything else. It's just 2%, 2%, 2%, 2%. But it doesn't matter if it's 2% right now or the 2% out there in the future. It's only the anchoring of long-term inflation expectation at 2% is what the Federal Reserve is really trying to shoot for. And it goes on to say, in order to anchor long-term inflation expectations at this level, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time. Therefore, judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. Again, this is the Federal Reserve statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategy. Their goal is not 2% target. The long-term future expectation of inflation is 2%, but the appropriate monetary policy is seeking to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. Right? Very much like what Jerome Powell was saying in his speech in August, which was actually in relation to the statement right here. So, I mean, I guess it's essentially just reiterating what the statement was saying. But it's also very much in line with what John Williams was saying a couple of years earlier, considering that the problem that they needed to solve these days was the risk of inflation that was persistently too low rather than too high. So now that they got the inflation too high and moderately above 2%, they're going to do it for some time. Whatever some time is. We haven't figured that part out. Now, many times people will say to me, dude, this is old stuff, man. Why don't you talk about something new, right? Why don't you talk about a newer speech or something of that nature? Here, this is April 5th of 2025. This is Michelle Bowman's Risk and Uncertainty in Monetary Policy, Current and Past Considerations. Okay, so in this speech, she had this to say. And again, this is April of 2024. So this is, I don't know, like 7 months ago, whatever it was. Right? How long ago was that? April? Yeah. Right? So it was like, 7, 8 months ago or something. Okay. This is what Michelle Bowman had to say. Another notable change to the strategy statement was the adoption of what some refer to as asymmetric flexible average inflation targeting. Again, flexible average inflation targeting, FAIT, right? She even puts it asymmetric, right? Asymmetric flexible average inflation targeting, what a mouthful. Or temporary price level targeting. Specifically, the new statement noted that, quote, in order to anchor, and this is her quote, right? In order to anchor long-term inflation expectations at its 2% goal, the committee seeks to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time and therefore judges that following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. Right? You see how this is going on for 4 years? See, this is what drives me nuts about all these people out there on YouTube screaming about how the Federal Reserve doesn't know what they're doing. They're doing this to you on purpose, and you're accepting it. And the more you scream about how it's painful to you, the more it works for them. And that's what's driving me crazy about this, is that the more people are screaming out there on the internet about how the Federal Reserve is causing this pain and misery and suffering to all the people with the inflation expectation, the more it works in their monetary policy favor. It raises the neutral interest rate. When they raise the neutral interest rate, that gives them the ability to lower rates to the lower bound of zero again, be far enough below the neutral interest rate to stimulate the economy. This is exactly what John Williams was saying. It's what Jerome Powell has been saying. It's what they have been talking about just recently. All right? The Federal Reserve has said it. They want to get their Fed funds rate closer to neutral. Well, do they need to go to neutral, or can neutral find them? All right? If you have the inflation expectation elevated, if you elevate the inflation expectation, you will raise the neutral interest rate. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to break down here real quick for you. How long are we in this? 26 minutes. Perfect. A half an hour video. I love it. Okay. Last part of this speech. Again, links down in the description for all this stuff, every bit of it. This is the final part that I want to break down, because a lot of times when we hear about the average inflation rate over time with no mathematical formula for figuring it out, that's where a lot of people get very upset with the whole idea that they are just making these numbers up and stuff like that. Don't think that. They're more systematic than that. Okay? This is what it goes on to say. A second significant date is September 2020, when the FOMC revised its statement on long-run goals and monetary policy strategy. Just what we were talking about, what Jerome Powell was talking about, right? This change to average inflation rate over time, the appropriate monetary policy being above 2% for some time. Okay, that's what he's referring to. I'm just trying to reiterate that. All right, and in this update, the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee, right, adopted a flexible average inflation targeting. This is coming from the Richmond Fed, by the way. This isn't being made up by some, hokey whatever website. This is from the Federal Reserve itself. All the links are. Every single link I have comes directly from the Fed itself. All right. Flexible average inflation targeting, seeking to achieve inflation that averages 2% over time, and stated that, quote, following periods when inflation has been running persistently below 2%, appropriate monetary policy will likely aim to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time, end quote. Right? Just like what the policy was saying. When did this come out? Hold on one second. This is October 17th of 2023, by the way, guys. Right? So this is like a little over a year old. All right? I'll give you, it is a little old, but not that old, right? It's a little old. All right, end quote. Let's see here. Since the revised statement was released, headline PCE inflation has run at a pace of 5% per year, and core inflation has run at a pace of 4.4% per year on average. Okay, so again, this is from a year ago, a little over a year ago, and when inflation was running, much higher than it is today. This is the important part, because we always ask that question. How are they seeing inflation? If they don't see inflation on the short term, long term, how do they find in this average inflation with no mathematical formula for figuring it out? Listen very carefully, because this is it right here. This is how they're doing it. Okay. This took me a lot of time. This took me a lot of work to find this stuff, guys. To me, it seems real easy now because I've gone over it so many times, but it took me months, years of breaking this stuff down, figuring this stuff out, and breaking it down to these handful of speeches. There is so much more out there than what I am sharing with you. This isn't it. This is just the tip of the iceberg. right? What I am sharing with you is just a small, insignificant little portion of a much bigger, broader strategy that nobody knows about. You could be diving into this stuff way deeper than I have done. I'm not somebody who does like, I didn't go to school for this stuff. I'm not like, this isn't like my thing, right? I mean, it is my thing because it's fun and it's my passion. But outside of that, everything that I am sharing with you is just from my own research, my own just sheer curiosity of what has taken place out here. And this is what I found. So right here is how they figure out this average inflation rate over time with no mathematical formula. Right? Okay, here we go. And it says this. In its update, the FOMC did not define the window of time over which it would be looking back to assess progress towards its goal. By looking back far enough, it is possible to identify starting dates where average inflation rate through the present day has come in exactly at target. Think about that. Let me read it again, right? By looking back to assess progress towards its goal, right? It looks back. It says, okay, inflation is what today? If we look backwards far enough, how far back will we need to find if we incorporate all the inflation that we have right now, last week, last year, 2 years ago? How far back will we need to look in order to find the target, the 2% goal? All right. By looking back far enough, it is possible to identify starting dates where average inflation through the present day has come in exactly at target. For example, now again, this example was, from a year ago, so we kind of have to think the numbers from back then. For example, when considering inflation from October of 2008 through August of 2023, headline PC inflation averaged about 2% per year on average, right on target. This is how they're looking at inflation targeting. They look backwards. They look back over time and they say, how far back to what date will we need to see a 2% average inflation rate considering all the inflation we've had today? It's backward-looking inflation targeting, or inflation viewing, I guess. It's not really targeting. But backward-looking inflation viewing. Again, I left the link down in the description. I know this is confusing. You can go and read it for yourself, break it down for yourself, try and figure it all out for yourself, and this is how you have to internalize the information. Nobody else is going to do it. There is nobody else out there who is going to explain this stuff. This video right now, if this is the very first time you have ever heard this information, and never heard anybody breaking it down in such fashions, it's because this is the only place it's done. To this level, to this degree of strategy that we are focusing in on. You can go and take these speeches for yourself, break them down, go and dive deeper. Like I said, this is very small portion of what this is. It goes so much bigger and deeper than this. Most people will never see it. Most people have no clue why it is that the Federal Reserve is backing off on the interest rate cuts when they promised 4 cuts this year. Right? They promised 4 cuts or something of that nature. I can't remember what it was because I don't really even pay attention to that anymore. Right? I listen to the communication about what is happening and how it is that the markets react to that communication. That's it. That is the only thing I pay attention to anymore. Right? I mean, I look at and pay attention to the numbers. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I look at them, but the important part to listen to is that communication and how the markets react to that information. And now, when you think about the elevated inflation expectation coming into the future, that raising the neutral interest rate, making it ever closer to the Fed funds rate, the Federal Reserve doesn't have to work that hard to find neutral again. This is where they are working. This is how they conduct themselves. All righty, guys. Thank you for listening. We have quite a few people. We got 219 people watching right now. We got a few super chats. Let's go check out these super chats. I don't know how long I'm going to be out here. I was just going to try and do this for a half an hour, but I'm sure that some people have some questions. So let's go and break this stuff down. Don't kill me. I'm just a vibe. I love it. I love the names. All right. Thank you for the $10. Bonds suggest the Federal Reserve may implement emergency rate cuts also 1 year. Chinese bonds indicates a significant flight to safety, signaling an impending negative economic event. Well, I kind of agree with that with the China situation because that's kind of been building for quite some time. The bond market, I think, is too distorted to use for any kind of real significance as far as like what it is that it's going to be predicting the Federal Reserve to do, because I don't think it's been right at all. Like, I don't think I mean, it hasn't been right about the recession prediction, about the, inverted yield curve, uninverting. It hasn't been right about a lot of stuff. Like, I mean, people say that the bond market is the significance to watch for, and I'm thinking it is so overwhelmingly consumed by that of the banking system and through the quantitative easings and the quantitative tightenings and that sort of thing that has happened, that I just think it's so distorted now that it doesn't quite paint the picture that it once did. Like back in the day when the Federal Reserve didn't participate inside of the bond market as much as they do now, like with the quantitative easings and tightening, I think it was a much different much different storyteller than it is today. So I'm not saying that it's not significant. I'm not trying to say that at all. Like, the bond market is incredibly significant. But as far as the stories that it tells comparatively to what it had told in the back in the day, especially things like that inverted yield curve and the uninverted yield curve, I mean, I still very well could happen that we would go into a recession, but the idea that the yield curve is going to predict these sort of things isn't quite what it once was. Like, I mean, I think it's good to keep an eye on it, but as far as being like that fortune teller, I just don't see it being that as it once was. Really, when it comes to the bond market, I think still following what Greenspan said about the bond market when it came to the inverted yield curve, and he said that that was a very good indicator, but that what is a better indication to watch is the spread between the 5-year, 30-year. And when you see that 5-year, 30-year spread widen, what he was saying is that's corporate management's, that is a sign of corporate management's willingness to invest, and it's a very good sign of economic times. So again, like, I don't know anything about anything, right? I mean, but this guy seems to know a lot about the economy, or did at one time anyhow. And so, I mean, I don't know. He's getting pretty old. Is he still alive even? Anyway, I don't mean to talk bad about it. But that's kind of what he had said about the bond market back then. And that was quite a few years ago. So, although I watch the bond yields and I watch where they go and stuff, as far as those indications and those storytellers like they once were, I just don't see it like that, as much, I should say. Wow, look at all these comments. My goodness. Okay. Don't kill me, I'm justified with the $2. Thank you again. All right, the feds use the Taylor rule to find rates. I think like a lot of this stuff has been pushed. I for the longest time, right? And I have said it. And when people ask me to try and predict it and talk about it, and I would answer back the same way, and I always did. The interest rate adjustments don't matter. That's not the important thing, right? And that's so difficult for most people to try and wrap their head around, because to them that is the most important thing. But then when I think about it, it was just like the Federal Reserve elevated interest rates, and they've cut them some, but not that much. And there's already talk of reversing this, like not cutting as much and even raising rates. And I'm thinking they're talking about all this rate adjustments and having to deal with these rate adjustments and all the other stuff. None of that has any impact on the economy yet. Like it will, but it takes 6 months to a year. So here they are cutting rates and already talking about reversing how much they need to cut, or even raising rates going into the future, before the initial rate cuts had even had a chance to impact the economy. And yet people want to tell me or look at it and say, no, you need to talk more about the rates and how that impacts the economy. And I'm thinking it doesn't, right? It doesn't. Not yet. It will, and I mean they can over time, and if they're significant enough, they will have a serious impact on the economy. But for the most part, it's not the rate cuts that have the impact on the economy that people would want it to. It's the communication about it. And I mean, there's even speeches that break that down. Let me see if I have it here. Hold on. Yeah, here it is. It's called, and I didn't leave a link to this one, but it's called Communicating About Monetary Policy. It's literally, there's a whole speech that describes exactly how they conduct themselves using their words. Seriously, like it doesn't, this communicating about monetary policy has very little to talk about the adjustment of interest rates, has everything to talk about communication, about the monetary policy and how that communication truly impacts the economy and how it works. And I mean, for those of you who follow me on my channel, you've heard me talk about this a lot, but again, this is the title of the speech is Communicating About Monetary Policy, given by Phillips Jefferson, May 13th, 2024. So again, this isn't even that long ago. This is just, again, 8 months ago or whatever. It says, in 1981, Karl Brunner, the Swiss monetary economist, called central banking an esoteric art and lamented central bank's inherent impossibility to articulate its insight in explicit and intelligible words and sentences. Basically saying that they just couldn't do it. They couldn't talk. They couldn't talk to the public. They couldn't explain themselves, and there's no way that they would be able to understand the public would understand what they were saying anyway. That's what he was saying. At the time, central banking wisdom dictated that the monetary policy should say as little as possible. Some research of that vintage tried to rationalize this secrecy through the notion that monetary policy would be particularly effective if it surprised the markets. Now, that's the way that the most central banks had conducted themselves for a very, very, very long time, is that they would keep it a secret and then they would surprise the markets, and then one day you would just wake up and there would be interest rate adjustments. This is what it goes on to say. Expectations became a focal point in the academic of policy circles with the emergence of the new Keynesian models in the 1990s as frameworks for monetary policy. In these models, aligning the expectation of decision makers in the private sector, that's the business owners, that's the investors, that's the people out there spending their money, right? The business, the decision makers in the private sector. If they were to align the expectations of the decision makers with those of the policy makers, produce superior economic outcomes. If everybody was on the same page, if you were knowing and hearing what they were saying, then it would produce superior outcomes. This is what it goes on to say. Mike Woodford, one of the developers of the new Keynesian model, put it this way: not only do expectations about policy matter, but very little else matters. Expectations about policy matters, very little else matters. Oops. All right. Goes on. During the tenure of Chairman Bernanke, there was another burst of innovation in the way monetary policy was communicated. In 2007, the first SEP, that's the Statement on Economic Projections, was published to convey systematically the economic outlook of the FOMC participants. In 2011, Chairman Bernanke started holding press conferences after every FOMC meeting, and in 2012, the Federal Reserve adopted explicit inflation targeting of 2% and stated publishing, and again, this is in 2012, and started publishing individual FOMC participants' views on the appropriate future path of the federal funds rate, now famously known as the dot plot. You see, like they figured out all these communications in order to deliver you this information. Burn my wife's battery up here. Okay. I'm gonna leave it at that. Let's go check out some of these super chats. Alrighty, guys. I'm not going to go much longer here because I want to keep this. Oops. I want to keep this at least under an hour. People get really kind of annoyed with the longer super chats. All right. Or with the longer super chats, with the longer live streams. Thank you very much for the super chats. Those aren't annoying at all. All right, Kevin, $4.99. Thank you so much for the. I hope you weren't too offended by my statements. All right, here, Kevin. Thank you for the $4.99. But we've seen how little control they have over the yield curve. They cut 100 basis point and yields went up. Most loans are not based on the Fed funds rate. Yeah, absolutely, I agree. But we've seen little how they control over the yield curve. Okay, you sent it to me twice. Yeah, and I think what ends up happening is that too much credit is put onto the Federal Reserve based off of some of the things that they have been communicating within the mainstream media and the way that the mainstream media has interpreted that information. When it comes to the mainstream communications of the Federal Reserve, I don't believe any of it. Like the words that they use, I do not believe. All right, not at all. These ones, the ones that are in the speeches, these are communications to the other central bankers out there. So this is the reason why you find it. Like how many times, how many speeches, how many places was I able to find moderately above 2% inflation? I found it all over the place. All over. Right? Average inflation rate over time. I found that all over the place. I could find it all over the Federal Reserve's websites, their documents, their speeches, their communications to each other. When I go to the mainstream media, crickets. Nothing. Other YouTubers, nothing. 2% target, all over the place. Everybody's talking about the 2% target. Average inflation rate over time, Fayette, nothing. Not a thing. Right? So again, when we think about like even, EU statement within the question itself, right? To me, I look at it and I think, okay, the Federal Reserve is going to go for an average inflation rate over time with inflation moderately above 2%, and they're going to have the Fed funds rate elevated, and they are not going to fall below neutral. And what they are really trying to do is get the neutral interest rate to rise ever higher to the Fed funds rate, and the Fed can sit on their hands the entire time, and they probably won't even have to adjust rates that much. That's what I've been thinking. That's what I've been trying to communicate. That's what I've been explaining out there to people. And it's very difficult because when you see the Federal Reserve go and do a half a rate point cut, everybody says, well, dude, you were wrong. And I'm thinking, really? I mean, it was a half a rate point. I mean, I get it. It was a half a percentage point. It was huge. It was significant. Everybody lost their mind over how much it was. And then here it is before that cut even has a chance to impact the economy. There's already communication about doing it the other way. Right? That's why I've stepped away from that mainstream media narrative crap about what it is that the Federal Reserve is up to. They are going for average inflation rate over time. No mathematical formula for figuring it out. They do it backwards looking. They're going for moderately above 2%. They're going to keep the Fed funds rate elevated and try to get the neutral interest rate to meet the Fed funds rate so that way they don't have to adjust it down to the Fed funds or adjust it down to neutral. If they pass neutral, they screwed up. That's when the Fed screwed up. If they lower the Fed funds rate and neutral passes it, and neutral goes above the Fed funds level, they have screwed up. They would much rather see neutral approach them than for them to miss neutral by dropping it too much. And that's really how it goes down. Yeah. This is good stuff. All this stuff that we break down here, man, this is all good stuff. Once you have it, see, like, in fact, here, let me see. Waller, right here. He says this. This is Waller's speech talking just about that very thing, what I was talking about. How they do not want to see them screw up by lowering the Fed funds rate too much and missing neutral. September 6th, 2024. What, not even 2 months, like a little over 2 months ago. 3 months ago. All right? September 6, 2024. And this is what he has to say on this one. Determining the appropriate pace at which to reduce policy restrictiveness, right? Because they're above neutral, they got to reduce the restrictiveness, will be challenging. Choosing a slower pace of rate cuts gives time to gradually assess whether the neutral rate has in fact risen, right? Gives them time. They're watching. Is the neutral interest rate rising? Is it coming ever closer to the Fed funds? But at the risk of moving too slowly and putting the labor market at risk. That's what they were worried about. Labor market isn't at risk. Still historically low unemployment. They're cool. We can be slow. That's what he was saying months ago, months and months and months ago. If the labor market's being okay, then we can be cool. We can chill on our cuts. Goes on to say, putting the labor market at risk. Okay, cutting the policy rate at a faster pace means a greater likelihood of achieving a softer landing, but at risk of overshooting rate cuts if the neutral rate has in fact risen. See, this is why they're so concerned about it. If they were to lower rates at a faster pace and they miss it and they pass neutral and they're now below neutral, that is their problem. That is the risk that they are not willing to face right now. They do not want to do that. They want to stay restrictive and let neutral find them. All right. Let's see. At the risk of overshooting rate cuts and the neutral rate when in fact the neutral rate has risen to pre-pandemic levels, this would cause an undesired loosening of monetary policy. See, just a few months ago they were talking about it. This stuff hasn't gone away. Like, I feel I have it more dialed in than anybody. Okay? And I'm not trying to be bragging or anything. It's like, that's the whole point about it. It's just like, it's frustrating at times, especially when I see so many other YouTubers who I know are smart individuals. I've listened to them. It's just like, I've learned so much from these guys, but then they communicate in a way that I was just like, man, why don't you just see this? I don't get it. I don't get like how it is that this information can exist out there from their own words, their own statements, leading all the way up to even just within the last few months, that they're still communicating this stuff, and yet nobody out there sees it. Absolutely nobody. People give me lists of all these people who are like, oh no, these people read the Fed speeches and these people talk about that stuff. No, they don't. They might read the Fed speeches. They don't know this stuff. If they did, they would be talking just like me, and you would find other people out there who are communicating it as well. There isn't, right? And maybe there is. Maybe I'm just not seeing it. But I have yet to find anybody, any article, any YouTube video that is breaking down the information like I have been doing. And I don't get it, why this has happened. I did the research just trying to figure out what was taking place with this whole neutral interest rate when I was reading John Williams' speech. And I'm thinking to myself, bro, how in the world are you going to find inflation if quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4 and the expansion of the Fed's balance sheet from $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion couldn't find inflation, but yet somehow you're going to be able to have this average inflation rate over time? Like, how do you plan on doing that, bro? And then here it is. And I'm like, wow, well, I didn't think that was going to happen. And I didn't see that one. Okay, COVID. I don't know. Like, I mean, it is a lucky miracle for them? Is that what happened? I mean, it's just like they begged for a situation in which that they would have an elevated inflation expectation so that they could save their monetary policy, and they totally got it. Even today, right? Even right now, they're like, hell, we got to have this elevated inflation, got to have these elevated interest rates. With all that, it could raise the neutral interest rate and land us right where we want to be. All right? Alrighty, guys, we're going to give it 5 minutes and then we're going to call it quits. We're going to do it an hour video. All right. Unemployment is like 15% if you count the actual people with benefits and yeah. See, this is another thing. Like, I understand that the real numbers out there are probably far different, but we're not looking at the real numbers. We're looking at the numbers that the Federal Reserve is looking at because they're the ones who are in charge of monetary policy. Like, we're not trying to figure out the way they should be doing monetary policy. I mean, there's a million ways that they could be doing it. It would benefit me better than it would probably benefit you. But I'm not here to try and figure out how they should be doing monetary policy. I'm here to figure out how they are doing monetary policy so that I can figure out what I need to do because I have no expectations that they're going to change for me. Right. So, yeah, they might look at, I mean, unemployment might be a whole different number than what is truly out there when it comes to their policy, when it comes to their monetary policy, their strategies, what they're looking at, that's what we have to look at as well in order to understand what they are planning on doing so that we can figure out what we need to do about that. All right. Old Nod says, hey, Putz. All right, we got so many people up in here. Hi, Simon. I'm glad I caught you live. The Fed is in a pinch for sure. They're not. I don't think so. Thanks for being here, John. I don't think so. I think they're exactly where they want to be. I don't think this is a pinch. They have elevated interest rates. They have elevated inflation expectation. They got fairly low unemployment. They got the neutral interest rate working its way up to their position. They don't have to do anything. They can sit on their hands and do nothing and still achieve their goal. They're just using their words. And it's totally working for them. Like for us, it sucks. Like I get it. Like for us, it's painful experience and all that other stuff. And I'm not trying to say, yay, it's working and it's awesome and all this other stuff. I'm not trying to say that. What I'm trying to say is that the Federal Reserve is conducting themselves exactly how it is that they said that they wanted to be, conducting themselves in the position that they wanted to be, and this is it. This is exactly where they wanted to be. They don't like, from what I can gather and read, what they don't like is the fact that the government is on an unsustainable debt path. Right? That's one thing I did hear a lot about, and that does seem to be a concern for them as well. All right. We all know that inflation is higher than what the Fed says. Why do we choose the metrics where they have low inflation? We don't choose it. They choose it. We're choosing to choose the information that they are using to find their monetary policy so that we can figure out what it is that we need to do for the best decisions in accordance to what that monetary policy is. That's the point of it. It doesn't matter what the information is. We can look at it and say, no, it's way different. What difference does that make? It doesn't change monetary policy. It doesn't change the way they're conducting themselves. It doesn't change any of that stuff. We can look at it and say, hey, it's way different from that. And the Federal Reserve is screwed up and they don't know what they're doing. And with that, you might as well just turn off the video because what we're talking about is the Federal Reserve's monetary policy strategy and how it is that we can conduct ourselves in accordance to that. But if you don't believe any of the information at all, any of their words or any of this stuff, then there's no point in being here. Right? And it's not a matter of believing it. It's not a matter of believing whether or not it's factual, right, or any of that other stuff. It's a matter of figuring out what it is that they are planning on doing, how it is that they are conducting themselves, why it is that people are out there saying they're going for a 2% target when they are clearly not, and that they want moderately above 2%, which is exactly where we're at. And as people are saying, man, they have to work harder to try and achieve their goals. No, they don't. They don't have to do anything to achieve their goals. They can just sit there. And their goals are being achieved all on their own by simply having an elevated inflation expectation and raising the neutral interest rate. The Federal Reserve can just sit there, literally sit there and do nothing at all and still achieve their goals. So long as people have that elevated inflation expectation. All right. Actually, I love the New Mexico, but the city of Albuquerque is a zombie apocalypse movie now. Ooh, bummer. Get rich and have assets, and you'll be on the right side of the Fed's monetary policy. Simple. I guess. All right. You know, and that's where I find it like pretty disheartening for a lot of times when I see like comments saying, dude, you're just on the Fed side, you want them to win or something of that nature. And I'm thinking to myself, it was just like, my God, like the information that I am presenting, if I really honestly feel that if everybody knew this stuff to the like, and again, I'm just touching on the very tip of the iceberg here. This goes way deeper than what I have presented. And considering what it is that some people could do out there for real research beyond what it is that I'm doing, if everybody had this sort of information, the Federal Reserve would not be able to conduct themselves. It would be over. Like, you want to end the Fed? This is how you end the Fed. This is how you truly end the Fed. Everybody else out there who's screaming inflation and money printer is causing all the purchasing power loss and all that kind of stuff, they're actually enhancing the Fed. They're creating the scenario in which that the Federal Reserve gets their ammunition back. They don't end the Fed. They want to end the Fed. They believe that they want to end the Fed, and the Federal Reserve used that sort of energy and mindset against the people themselves. Like, it's strange. I know it's strange to hear and think and see, but this is the craziest, biggest psyops operation in the history of time. I mean, there's probably been bigger ones, but this one's pretty significant, right? And I mean, to me, it's just like blatantly obvious, so obvious. And I know for a lot of the viewers of this channel, it's becoming very obvious as well. And that's why I left all those links to all these speeches down in the description. So you can go and print them out yourself, highlight those spots, right? And then show people if you can get them to, if they're willing to listen. Say, here, look, it's lining up. Year after year after year, they were lining this up, setting it up so that they could be in this position to handle this issue with the lower bound and the Fed funds rate. And once they figured out how to communicate, they were like, man, we really don't even need a monetary policy of interest rate adjustments. We can just literally use our words. The only problem is you can't use your words if you don't have something to talk about. So this is where the monetary policy of the Fed funds adjustments starts becoming the tool, the communication about it. But you have to have it well above the neutral interest rate in order to even communicate about it. So fun. All right, guys, I'm going to call it quits. This was a good time. I really enjoyed it. I hope everybody else enjoyed it. I know sometimes I get really excited when I talk this stuff down, and I get it, man. Like, I'm just as frustrated as a lot of you are out there, especially when it comes to the banking system, the separation of, the massive inequality that we have, the separation between the rich and the poor, how difficult it is to try and make those ends meet, especially when you have these inflationary pressures that are coming, and it feels so painful, and you want to blame somebody, or you want to find a relief for the issues that we are facing. Understanding the problem, internalizing in knowing what it is that the Federal Reserve is using for their own strategy, and you will begin, I assure you, you will just begin to just be in a world of understanding it in a different way, and you will just naturally be making decisions that are more appropriate. And I know it's strange to think, it's like, a lot of times people will ask me, and it was just like, give me like, I even had somebody that was just like, give me concrete examples of how you use this information. You can't. Every single person is going to be using this stuff differently. If you are a rancher with $1 million in debt, trying to figure out how it is that you can continue on operating your life, your family's operation that's been there for however long, that is a completely different mindset from some dude who's working at a lumberyard over in the Pacific Northwest, right? There is not even the same thing happening there with this information. They're not going to use it the same way. However, understanding that the Federal Reserve was going for moderately above 2% for some time and not actually going to go for a 2% target on their goal gives you a whole different outlook on what it is that they are going to be doing with their monetary policy when it comes to the adjustment of interest rates. Most people have no clue about any of it. And it is so frustrating when I see the mainstream media just spitting out massive amounts of crap out there for people to just gobble up, and meanwhile the exact thing that they are bitching and complaining about is the power that is being delivered to the Fed itself. It's just, that's the frustrating part of it for me. Alrighty, guys, I'm going to call it quits. You are a wonderful crowd. Thank you much for being here. 180 people watching with 150 likes. Thank you so much for hitting that like button. Be sure and share this video. At least share the links down in the description. I mean, the video is neither here nor there at this point. But the links down in the description, this is where all the information is. And again, it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? I am delivering just the basic, some basic documents. It's deep. It's difficult to get through a lot of this stuff. But this is just the beginning of it. There's to go so much deeper. There is so much more to talk about and discuss and break this stuff down. So even if you don't share the video, go and look at those links. Go and read those speeches. Internalize that information. Recognize it. Share it with your friends. All right. I mean, there's no way that we can solve the problems of the world. Right. We're not going to be able to do that. We can fix the problems that we have for ourselves. And we can see it in relation to what's going on out there in the world. And if we have a better understanding of what's going on within this banking system, then we'll have a better understanding of what it is that we need to do for ourselves as well. Okay, guys. Good times. Uneducated Economist. You let me know.